Hi, welcome to Lecture 9 in Soccer 3666. The content of this lecture is about the politics and poetics of branding. So where we moved at looking at specific things in the course so far, then we moved to the spaces. Now we're kind of using the brand in a way to kind of bring some of that together to move out into more global culture. And then particularly at the end of this, the lecture, in this lecture 9, the work of Naomi Klein, to start thinking about some of the physical and political elements of consumer culture. So I'm thinking here today about kind of the way that value is defined through the brand and different conceptions of that. So shifting away from looking at things and spaces particularly, and start thinking about how the notion of the brand starts to stand in for the value of both of those things, of the things and the spaces. So we're shifting here from the tangible notion of the commodities themselves to the ways that consumer culture sets up the intangible symbolic values around consumer products through the very notion of the brand, and particularly through the notions, through the techniques of advertising. So value here means, a number of different things. We can think about it in various ways. Firstly, brands use values to promote stuff to us. Values themselves are promoted and they're used to sell us stuff. And this is often done where brands try and associate themselves with a particular kind of good. Coke is the real thing. It's about, happiness and all that kind of stuff. Nike tries to associate itself, or has historically, with various forms of athletic cool. But also, we can then use values to critique those consumer culture, a kind of more political understanding of what values means there. Certainly looking at the brand kind of highlights the increased distance between the use value of products and their symbolic value. And again here, the ways that you can think of the ways that most of our consumer goods are made in similar factories, similar places all around the world. Use value used to kind of attach itself to brands in many ways as a notion of quality, yet as things are mass produced, they're largely often made in the same places and just have different logos on them. Now that's not to say certainly that brands still don't pertain to values and quality in value in the economic sense and quality in the actual, how good is the product sense. But increasingly, mass-produced products don't necessarily pertain to the use value there. It's more about the symbolic value. So we're looking at the kind of physical and environmental nature of that in some of the future lectures. Importantly here, brands here helps us have a look at the shift from tangible commodities to the intangible values that are used to promote them. So again, I think that the reading this week goes over this stuff quite well. And it sets up a kind of a useful dichotomy to have a look through these things. The poetics, understanding the symbolic economy of advertising and consumer culture, where brands sell us lifestyle. They don't necessarily sell us their things. Quite often now you watch an ad and you won't actually, hard to tell what it's about or what the thing it's meant to be selling you. It'll just be kind of a brand logo will come up at the end. So here we're being sold a lifestyle, not necessarily things. Then we'll have a look at the politics of that. Now much of the critique of this kind of talks about how brands themselves promote the symbolic and intangible aspects of lifestyle in a way to, again, mask the interface between the first world where most of these things are consumed, and what we call the third world, what we call the developing world, what I would prefer called the majority world, is where these things are actually produced and the exploitative labour between those things. So Naomi Klein's book No Logo is just a hugely influential and really important text in the understanding of that kind of the distancing of production and consumption, and the way that globalization and the politics around it became a huge deal in terms of consumer politics in the late 90s and early 2000s. So, in terms of the poetic side first, certainly the brands themselves dominate consumer culture. In fact, many critical theorists argue that brands dominate culture itself, to the point where, like even sporting teams talk about themselves as having a brand, and individuals themselves often refer to themselves as having a brand. And you can see this in particular when a rugby league player will get busted doing something violent or stupid or whatever. They apologise for damaging the brand of the club and the code, but often they'll then talk about damaging their own brand. So you can see here that the very notion of brand has become, in some ways, a form of self-identity that cuts across the self and social identity dichotomy. Brands are created as the heart and soul or the personality of the company. That shiny face of consumer culture. The idea of a brand is not just, again, in terms of the name of the brand and its logo, but the brand here is like an assemblage of values that the company wants to represent itself as. Again, it's important here that brands tend to promote these kind of values, symbols, and lifestyles as much as the very product that the brand represents. So again, we can hark back to the semiotics here, and certainly the kind of different negotiated readings we can have of these things. There's a huge amount of work done in encoding brands through PR and all that, and advertising and that stuff. But in the end, it's up to us to decode these things, and we do that in a kind of plethora of different ways. So the history of branding, is kind of a couple of centuries old now. They were certainly originally designed to mark quality and price and function. Advertisers started to kind of argue that people couldn't tell things apart. So they needed help to tell things apart. And so they invented, brands to do this as a kind of way of marking maybe a good quality suit over a bad quality suit or shoes or whatever. So in some ways there, you can see that advertisers, and you see this on shows like Grew and Transfer all the time, often seem to think a lot like critical theorists, or semioticians at least anyway. As these things develop and become more and more important to companies in particular in the way they market their products, notions of conspicuous consumption and distinction become deeply embedded in how advertising works. Advertising basically uses those apparent motivations for people, social motivations, to sell us stuff. Behavioural sciences and forms of psychology are brought into this, to people's behaviours are studied, just focus groups and all that kind of stuff, in an effort to try and connect brands with people emotionally. Now remember, this isn't to make people happy, but it's to exploit some kind of need or want here. Ads particularly don't seem to mostly designed to make us very happy. They seem to really to try and provoke a form of insecurity or an unhappiness or anxiousness, and you try and fix that with buying a particular thing. And there's an ad there that I use quite a bit as an example of that. A parody of an ad anyway, but done by the Webb and Mitchell, that I think is a nice making the normal look strange there. What's also happened over time is that ads have become increasingly fictitious, symbolic, metaphorical, and even absurd. So where they used to kind of just talk about the function of a particular product, then throughout the 50s and 60s, the notion of lifestyle was embedded into ads more and more. Particularly, you would have seen the gendered notions of this, where the notion of the housewife was used to increasingly sell white goods and stuff like that. And more recently, we've moved from those demographics of particularly designing ads and PR to particular demographics, whether that might be working class females or middle class males or whatever, and then particularly throughout the 80s and 90s to different race and ethnic groups. The use of psychographics has been increasingly used, and this is a way of trying to actually, rather than brand to particularly social identities, trying to associate products with particular personality types. So all this has seen, the realm of advertising become particularly complex and multidimensional, and Baudrillard in particular is a really interesting theorist here to think about the political economy of the sign and simulation that the reading talks about quite a bit. In terms of the everyday use of these things, brands increasingly become something that represent who we are in processes of the presentation of the self in that kind of Goffman-esque way. Brands play a role in that notions of how we create our self-identity. They certainly play a role in how we judge others in terms of what the values we attach to brands and the way we think about people. And so their brands are particularly useful for thinking about how tastes classify and classify the classifier. So brands increasingly try and engender emotions. They want an affective reaction. They want us to kind of create an emotional attachment to brands as kind of, being almost a part of who we are. This has come to be called logophilia, where people will refer to themselves as a Nike person or an Apple person, not an iPhone person, not a Samsung person, and all that kind of stuff. So again, the logos here mask the materiality of the product itself. It's about the lifestyle and the kind of feelings evoked, not the actual things themselves. Certainly logos and brands are completely embedded in culture. They're certainly completely embedded in pop culture now, and most TV shows are just saturated with product placement. You'll see whole kind of channels now that are pretty much about products. You'll see like shows on Viceland that are basically made by Budweiser or other food companies or whatever, and again, the brand becomes central to what these shows are about more so than what's going on in the show itself.